Playboy Murders on ID is a 6-part series, and each part focuses on a different murder case, and in some way that case was connected to the Playboy world, whether there was a playmate involved or a bunny involved. When I first heard of the idea for the Playboy Murders, the producers showed me the cases they were thinking about covering, and they were cases that I had never heard of, and that really surprised me because I thought I knew everything about Playboy's history and about what happened to all the playmates and things like that, and that really intrigued me, and I really saw that as a show that I would love to watch. So I was really excited about these stories, and I was really excited to bring more attention to these stories, and that was something that really appealed to me. And it made me wonder if they were buried in any way. So that's always, a bad feeling, and it makes you want to help tell these stories for the people that aren't around to tell them anymore. I think when people think of Playboy or Playmates, they just think of like beautiful women and just very one-dimensional, sex symbols, but these are real people and they live real lives, and sometimes tragic things happen, and I think real human stories should be told. When I lived at the mansion, I felt safe in a lot of ways because you're living in this big house, behind a private gate with security. But sometimes, and I've learned this through the stories we're covering, sometimes that can be like a false sense of security for some of the women who are involved, because then after having all this exposure, they just go back to their normal lives where they don't have that security and they don't have that protection. And that can be a big adjustment sometimes, especially when fans and people who buy the magazines, sometimes there's people out there with, different ideas about what their accessibility should be. The story of Stacey Arthur sticks with me the most just because, she was in such a positive relationship with her husband, and he was so incredibly supportive of her, and they were both so, ambitious and hardworking, and this tragedy just tore all that apart. I was really surprised to learn about the 1-900 number. That took place about 10 or 15 years before I was involved with Playboy, and to me it was kind of surprising. It kind of seemed like something that didn't really align with what I understood the Playmate brand to be. It seemed a little accessible, or too accessible, especially during a time period where a 1-900 number was thought of generally as like a sex line. That didn't really seem appropriate to me. It seemed like it was giving people a little too much access, especially since these women were making the calls from their own homes. So I was really surprised to learn about that. These are definitely really important cautionary tales for people who might want to go after fame or exposure, because I think from the outside, you look at famous people and you think they all must have money and be really well taken care of and not have a care in the world, but that's not true. Fame doesn't necessarily guarantee you money or security or safety, and there's a lot of downside that comes with it. So I think it's important that people know that. One of the really tragic things about Jasmine Fiore's story is, she was somebody who, by all accounts, was in love, and this attack came from the person who was closest to her, and, they were wrapped up in like some fame and drugs and fast lifestyle and things like that, and it's really scary when your murderer could be your partner. When I lived at the mansion for 7 years, that involved some very dark times for me. And because I experienced those things, it makes me feel like I can resonate with these stories a little bit. And it really makes me want to share these real people's stories, especially since many of these people aren't around to share the stories themselves. And maybe some of the stories didn't get as much press attention as they should have in the beginning. And I think it's really important to tell these stories, just from a human standpoint. What viewers can take away from some of these stories is sometimes when you get a little bit of time in the limelight or a little bit of fame, a lot of negativity can come with that. And I think from the outside, people don't see that. Like when I would see people on TV growing up, I thought they just had it made. And like, if you're famous, you're automatically rich and you're automatically protected and you're automatically safe. And that's not the case at all for so many people. And I think that's important to know. I think fame isn't necessarily the most desirable thing, as some people think it might be. I think I realized there was a dark side to Playboy probably like after, my first night out with the group, or right when I moved in. But I wanted it to be better. And I wanted, when you're young, you feel like, okay, well, this is just like, I have to be a hard worker and I have to, make it in the world or do what I have to do. But, as time went on, over the years, you just kind of realize where the actual problems lie. I feel like all this backstory that's coming out about the Playboy world is really surprising to a lot of people. And the Playboy Murders definitely expands on that and goes into so many people's real lives after they left the company and what happened to them after, posing and things like that. The first TV show I ever did was a reality show where I was presented as being a certain way, but that wasn't me at all. It was just like all these edited clips to make me look completely different. So being behind the scenes on a show that's about facts and real stories and that's very sympathetic toward the victims is really rewarding to me because I love telling real stories and I love being a part of that. There's no way that Hef and Playboy weren't aware of all these stories just because they did. I know that they did collect, all the media and the press clippings and anything ever mentioned having to do with the brand. But of course they weren't focused on because they weren't positive stories, but I think they're important stories to tell because they're real stories and these people aren't around to tell their stories anymore. And sometimes there's takeaways and things to be learned from these horrible things that could really happen to anybody. We're living in a time where everyone has a voice now, whether it's through social media or just expanding media in general. And we can hear the stories of real people who maybe didn't get that attention before because maybe the powers that be didn't want these stories out, or maybe, they weren't thought of as something that was important in the news cycle at the time. Now we're in a time where people want to hear everybody's story. People want to hear the truth. 3 words I would use to describe the Playboy Murders on ID are shocking, compelling, and surprisingly real, because these are all real people. They're just like you and me. These kind of things could happen to anyone, and there's just something so compelling and engaging about that. People should watch the Playboy Murders because these are real stories about real people who sadly aren't around to tell their own story anymore, and I feel like so many of these stories didn't get the attention that they deserve, and I feel like there's something we can learn from these stories because these things could happen to anyone.